Dance of Deception. New York, 1917. Margaret Hayes received a telegram in the middle of the night.
Sergent Henri Whittaker en route home.
Do not notify authorities. Her hands shook as she turned it over. No official stamp. No sender's name. Just a single fingerprint smudged in the corner. Chapter 1. The telegram that wasn't signed. The crinkle of the cheap paper was the only sound louder than the frantic thumping of Margaret Hayes' heart. Outside, the pre-dawn hush of New York City in April 1917 was barely disturbed by the occasional rumble of a distant delivery truck, a stark contrast to the tempest brewing within the walls of her modest brownstone on East 35th Street. The telegram, delivered just moments ago by a boy barely old enough to shave, felt like a burning coal in her trembling hands.
Sergent Henri Whittaker en route home.
Do not notify authorities. Each word, stark and black against the pale yellow, pulsed with a forbidden urgency.
Henry.
Her Henry. Back from the hell that was Flanders Field?
Impossible.
The last letter, postmarked nearly 3 months prior, had spoken of mud, relentless rain, and the ever-present shadow of death. It had spoken of duty, of honor, of a war that seemed destined to consume everything in its path. It had not spoken of hope. She reread the telegram, her breath catching in her throat. Do not notify authorities. That single line, a chilling decree, twisted the knot of anxiety in her stomach tighter.
Why?
What had happened? Was he wounded? A deserter? The thought sent a shiver of ice down her spine. Henry, a deserter?
No.
He was a man of unwavering principle, a man who had volunteered, leaving behind a promising career in law, a life of privilege, and her. Margaret rose from the velvet chaise lounge, the telegram clutched so tightly in her hand that the edges began to soften and fray. The faint scent of lilac, her favorite, from the vase on the nearby table, seemed to mock the growing dread that filled the room. The room, usually a sanctuary of soft lamplight and the comforting tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, felt suddenly alien, cold. She walked to the window, her bare feet silent on the polished wooden floor. The sky was beginning to lighten, painting the edges of the buildings across the street with a pale, watery gray. The city was waking up, oblivious to the earthquake that had just shattered her carefully constructed world. Her reflection stared back at her, a ghostly image in the pre-dawn gloom. Margaret Hayes, 32, unmarried, a spinster by the standards of the day, but a woman who had carved out a life of quiet independence. Her chestnut hair, usually neatly pinned, was loose, framing a face that, even in its current state of shock, held a quiet strength. The lines around her eyes, earned from years of late nights spent poring over legal briefs for her father's firm, a secret she kept from most of society, seemed deeper now, etched by worry and a growing sense of foreboding. She had met Henry Whittaker at a society ball 5 years ago, a whirlwind of silk gowns, champagne, and whispered promises. He was everything she wasn't, bold, brash, and utterly captivating. Their courtship had been a dance of stolen glances, clandestine meetings in Central Park, and letters filled with a passion that defied the rigid social constraints of the time. He'd proposed under a canopy of stars, the city lights twinkling like a million captured fireflies. She'd said yes, her heart soaring. Then the war. His departure had been swift, brutal. A hurried goodbye at Grand Central Terminal, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and the sobs of other women saying farewell to their husbands, sons, and lovers. A single, desperate kiss, a whispered promise to return, and then he was gone, swallowed up by the throng of khaki-clad soldiers marching towards an uncertain future. The telegram offered no signature. That, in itself, was a scream in the silent room. Henry always signed his letters with a flourish, a bold HW. Followed by a drawing of a small, whimsical bird, a lark, he said, for her soaring spirit. This was sterile, impersonal, terrifying. She turned the flimsy paper over, searching for some clue, some hint of its origin. Nothing. Except in the bottom right-hand corner, barely visible, was a smudge. A dark, almost black smudge that, upon closer inspection, revealed the faint, swirling lines of a fingerprint. It was partially obscured by the ink, but undeniably there. A fingerprint. Whose? And why leave such a blatant, incriminating mark? A wave of nausea washed over her. This wasn't a message of hope, it was a warning. A warning wrapped in a riddle, steeped in danger. She had to think, to act quickly. But who could she trust? Her father, a staunch patriot, would immediately contact the authorities. Her friends, mostly society wives, would be of little help, their world confined to tea parties and charity balls. There was only one person she could think of, a man she hadn't seen in years, a man who lived on the fringes of society, a man who knew the shadows of the city better than anyone, her brother, Thomas. A journalist, a muckraker, a man who had a knack for uncovering secrets and a deep-seated distrust of authority, born from a past she preferred not to dwell upon. He was her only hope, and finding him, before the authorities found Henry, was now her only mission. The city was wide awake now. The rising sun cast long, distorted shadows down the street. She had no time to waste. The clock was ticking. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Brownstone. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times, each strike a hammer blow against Margaret's already frayed nerves. She had changed quickly, discarding her nightgown for a practical gray skirt and a high-necked blouse, a concession to the chill that had settled deep in her bones. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman on the edge, her eyes wide and dark, her lips pressed into a thin, determined line. She had to appear calm, collected, even if her insides were churning with a mixture of fear and a desperate, fragile hope. She wouldn't go to Thomas's apartment directly. That would be too risky. He was often under surveillance, his articles in the New York Investigator having made him a thorn in the side of several powerful figures, including those in the War Department. She needed a go-between, someone discreet, someone Thomas trusted. Her mind settled on Mrs. O'Malley, the elderly Irish woman who ran a small bakery on the ground floor of Thomas's building in Greenwich Village. Mrs. O'Malley had a soft spot for Thomas, often leaving him a loaf of her famous soda bread or a slice of apple pie on his doorstep. She also had a keen eye and a sharp tongue, and most importantly, she was fiercely loyal. Margaret grabbed her coat and hat, a worn but elegant ensemble that spoke of better days, and slipped out of the brownstone, the telegram tucked securely into her reticule. The streets were bustling now, a cacophony of sounds and smells, the clatter of horses' hooves on the cobblestones, the shouts of vendors hawking their wares, the exhaust fumes from the increasingly common motor cars. The city felt vibrant, alive, yet Margaret felt utterly disconnected, an island of anxiety in a sea of normalcy. She hailed a cab, a relatively new contraption that she still viewed with a mixture of fascination and suspicion, and gave the driver the address near Thomas's apartment. As the vehicle lurched and swayed through the crowded streets, she practiced what she would say to Mrs. O'Malley, rehearsing the words in her mind, trying to strike the right balance between urgency and discretion. She couldn't simply blur out the contents of the telegram. She needed to be subtle, to gauge Mrs. O'Malley's reaction, to ensure her loyalty before revealing anything too sensitive. The thought of Henry being branded a deserter, a traitor, was unbearable. She had to protect him, even if it meant risking everything. The cab pulled up a block away from Thomas's building, a slightly dilapidated but charming structure that housed a mix of artists, writers, and working-class families. Margaret paid the driver and walked the remaining distance, her senses on high alert. She scanned the street, looking for any sign of surveillance, any indication that she was being followed. The city, once a familiar comfort, now felt like a labyrinth of potential threats. Mrs. O'Malley's bakery was a haven of warmth and the comforting aroma of freshly baked bread. The bell above the door jingled merrily as Margaret entered, the sound a stark contrast to the turmoil within her. Mrs. O'Malley, a stout woman with a flour-dusted apron and a face etched with the wisdom of years, looked up from behind the counter, her blue eyes twinkling with recognition. "Miss Hayes, isn't it? A bit early for you, dearie. What can I get for you?" Margaret forced a smile. "Good morning, Mrs. O'Malley. I was hoping you might have a moment." It's about Thomas. Mrs. O'Malley's smile faded slightly, her eyes narrowing with concern. Is he all right? He hasn't been by in a few days. Said he was working on a big story. I believe he is, Margaret said, choosing her words carefully. But I have a message for him. A rather urgent one. I wouldn't want to leave it in his mailbox. Mrs. O'Malley studied her for a moment, her gaze piercing. Is it something to do with the war, dearie? Margaret hesitated, then nodded slowly. Yes, it is. The older woman sighed, a sound that held both weariness and understanding. This war, she muttered, shaking her head. It takes everything, doesn't it? She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. You can tell me, Miss Hayes. I'll make sure Thomas gets her message. And I won't breathe a word to a soul. Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. She reached into her reticule and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, separate from the telegram. On it, she had written a single sentence. He is coming home. Do not trust the authorities. She handed the note to Mrs. O'Malley. Please give him this. Tell him it's from a friend. He'll understand. Mrs. O'Malley took the note, her fingers surprisingly strong as they closed around the paper. I will, dearie. I will. And I'll pray for him, and for you. Margaret thanked her, her voice thick with emotion. She bought a loaf of bread, a small gesture of gratitude, and left the bakery, the scent of yeast and warm dough clinging to her clothes. The weight in her reticule was lighter now, but the burden on her heart remained. As she walked back towards the main street, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. A figure across the street, partially obscured by a newsstand, seemed to linger a moment too long. A man in a dark coat, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. Paranoia? Perhaps. But in this new, dangerous world, she couldn't afford to take any chances. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The whispers in the brownstone were growing louder. Chapter 3. The Ghost of Flanders Field. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. Margaret busied herself with mundane tasks, arranging flowers, sorting through old letters, attempting to read a novel, but her mind was constantly elsewhere, replaying the encounter with Mrs. O'Malley, analyzing the cryptic telegram, and above all, worrying about Henry. The image of the smudged fingerprint haunted her. It was a deliberate act, a message in itself, but its meaning remained elusive. Was it a warning from someone who knew Henry was in danger? Or was it a trap, a way to lure him and her into the hands of the authorities? She considered going to the police herself, presenting the telegram and seeking their help. But the words "do not notify authorities" echoed in her mind, a chilling refrain that fueled her distrust. Something was deeply wrong. Something that went beyond the usual horrors of war. As evening approached, she found herself drawn to Henry's study, a room she had kept meticulously preserved since his departure. It was a sanctuary of his presence, filled with his books, his papers, his scent of faint, lingering aroma of pipe tobacco and leather. The room was a stark contrast to the feminine touches of the rest of the house, a testament to his masculine energy, his intellectual curiosity, his unwavering spirit. She sat in his worn leather armchair, her fingers tracing the contours of the armrests, imagining him sitting there, reading, thinking, planning his next legal case. The silence of the room was broken only by the ticking of the clock on his desk, a steady, rhythmic pulse that seemed to mock the chaotic uncertainty of her situation. On his desk, a framed photograph of them together, taken just weeks before he left, caught her eye. They were standing on the Brooklyn Bridge, the wind whipping their hair, their faces radiant with happiness and a naive belief in a future that now seemed impossibly distant. He was in his civilian clothes, his arm around her waist, his eyes filled with a love that transcended the formality of the photograph. She picked up the frame, her fingers tracing the outline of his face, a wave of grief washing over her. Suddenly, a noise from downstairs startled her. A creak, followed by a soft thud. Her heart leaped into her throat. Was it Henry? Or someone else? She grabbed a heavy brass letter opener from the desk, her hand trembling, and crept towards the door. She listened intently, her ears straining to pick up any further sounds. Silence. Then another creak, closer this time. She held her breath, her body tensed, ready to confront whoever or whatever was in her house. Slowly, she opened the door and peered into the hallway. The house was shrouded in shadows, the only light filtering in from the street lamps outside. She moved cautiously, the letter opener held tightly in her hand, her senses on high alert. She reached the top of the stairs and looked down. A figure was silhouetted in the faint light from the entrance hall. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat. Her breath caught in her throat. "Henry?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure turned slowly, and for a moment, she saw his face. Pale, gaunt, his eyes hollowed by fatigue and something else, something darker. Scars, she hadn't noticed in the initial shock, marked his cheek and forehead. But it was him. He took a step towards her, and then another, his movements slow, almost hesitant. He looked like a ghost, a specter returned from the battlefield, a man both familiar and terrifyingly changed. "Margaret," he said, his voice raspy, barely above a whisper. The sound, though weak, sent a tremor of relief through her. It was him. He was alive. He stumbled, reaching out for the banister to steady himself. She rushed down the stairs, dropping the letter opener, which clattered on the wooden floor, the sound echoing through the silent house. She reached him just as he was about to collapse, catching him in her arms. He was heavier than she remembered, his body lean but solid, even after the ravages of war. She held him close, her face buried in his coat, the scent of damp wool and something else, something metallic and acrid, filling her nostrils. The scent of war, the scent of death. "Henry," she murmured again, her voice choked with emotion. "You're home. You're really home." He didn't answer, his body trembling in her arms. She could feel the rapid beat of his heart, a frantic rhythm that mirrored her own. He was here. But the relief was tinged with a growing sense of dread. He was not the same man who had left her. He was a ghost of Flanders Field, and he had brought the shadows of the war home with him. The silence held, heavy and expectant. Chapter 4. A Stranger at Pier 54. The weight of Henry in her arms was both a comfort and a burden. He was alive, but barely. She managed to help him into the living room, easing him onto the sofa, his body slumping against the cushions like a discarded puppet. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and ragged. She knelt beside him, her hands hovering over him, unsure of what to do. She needed to get him upstairs to his bed, but he seemed too weak to move. She needed to call a doctor, but the telegram's warning echoed in her mind. "Do not notify authorities." That included doctors, she reasoned, anyone who might report his condition to the military. "Henry," she whispered, gently stroking his forehead.
Can you hear me?
His eyes flickered open, focusing on her with an effort. He tried to speak, but only a dry cough came out. She fetched a glass of water from the kitchen, her movements quick and efficient, her mind racing. She held the glass to his lips, and he drank greedily, the water dribbling down his chin. "Better?" she asked, her voice trembling. He nodded weakly, his eyes closing again. She took the opportunity to examine him more closely. His uniform, what was left of it, was torn and stained with mud and blood. His boots were caked in dirt. He looked like he had crawled straight out of the trenches. She carefully removed his coat, revealing more of the damage. His left arm was bandaged, the fabric stained with a dark, ominous stain. She gently touched the bandage, and he winced in pain. "We need to get you cleaned up," she said, more to herself than to him. "And I need to see that wound." She managed to get him upstairs, a slow, agonizing process, his weight leaning heavily on her. She settled him in his bed, the familiar surroundings seeming to offer him a small measure of comfort. He lay there, pale and still, his eyes closed, his breathing still labored. She worked quickly, efficiently, drawing on the nursing skills she had learned volunteering at a local hospital during the early days of the war. She cleaned his wounds, her touch gentle but firm, her heart aching at the sight of his ravaged body. The gash on his arm was deep, infected, and clearly needed medical attention. But she couldn't risk it. Not yet. As she worked, she talked to him, her voice low and soothing, telling him about her day, about the city, about anything that came to mind, hoping to keep him conscious, to anchor him to the present. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his words mumbled and incoherent. But at one point, he opened his eyes, focusing on her with a surprising intensity. Pier 54, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Tomorrow noon, Pier 54? She repeated, confused. What about Pier 54? He tried to say more, but his strength failed him. He closed his eyes, his breathing becoming more regular. He had fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep. Margaret sat beside him, watching him, her mind reeling. Pier 54. What did it mean? It was one of the busiest piers in the city, a hub for transatlantic shipping, a place where soldiers embarked and disembarked. Was he supposed to meet someone there? Was it connected to the telegram, to the warning? She looked around the room, searching for clues. His coat lay on the floor, discarded where she had left it. She picked it up, feeling the weight of it, the texture of the rough wool. Something inside one of the pockets crinkled. She reached in and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was another telegram, similar to the one she had received, but this one was even more cryptic. Meeting cancelled. Pier 54. Noon.
Be there.
Alone. This one, too, was unsigned, but it bore the same smudged fingerprint in the corner. The same hand. The same warning. The same danger. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. This was a trap. She was sure of it, but she couldn't ignore it. Henry had risked everything to come home, to deliver this message, to warn her. She had to go to Pier 54. She had to find out what was happening, even if it meant walking into the lion's den. She looked back at Henry, his face pale and peaceful in sleep. She would protect him. She would unravel this mystery. She would face whatever awaited her at Pier 54. She owed him that much. And she owed it to herself. The clock was ticking. She had less than 12 hours. He stirred, a slight moan escaping his lips, a sound that cut through her resolve and reminded her of the fragile life she held in her hands. Chapter 5. Scars beneath the uniform. The pre-dawn hours were a torment. Margaret barely slept, dozing fitfully in a chair beside Henry's bed, her mind replaying every word, every gesture, every detail of his unexpected return. The telegrams, the fingerprint, Pier 54, it all swirled in her head, a chaotic jumble of fear and uncertainty. Henry slept deeply, his breathing gradually becoming more regular, but his body still twitched occasionally, as if he were reliving the horrors of the battlefield in his dreams. She watched him, her heart aching with a mixture of love and pity. He was a stranger in many ways, a man scarred by experiences she could barely imagine. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, she rose and went to the window, looking out at the awakening city. The streets were still quiet, the early morning air crisp and cool. She needed a plan. She needed to be prepared for whatever awaited her at Pier 54. She decided to dress in a way that would allow her to blend in with the crowds, choosing a simple, dark dress and a nondescript hat that would partially obscure her face. She would carry a small, sturdy handbag, large enough to hold a few essentials, including a small, loaded pistol she had inherited from her father. She had never fired it, but she knew how to use it, and the weight of it in her hand gave her a small measure of comfort. Before leaving, she checked on Henry again. He was still asleep, his face pale but his breathing steady. She carefully rebandaged his arm, applying a salve she had found in his medicine cabinet, hoping it would help fight the infection. She left a note on his bedside table, a brief explanation of where she was going and a promise to return as soon as possible. She hesitated at the door, looking back at him, her heart filled with a mixture of love and fear. She whispered a silent prayer for his safety, for her own, and for the strength to face whatever awaited her. The journey to Pier 54 was a blur. She took a cab, avoiding eye contact with the driver, her mind focused on the task ahead. The city was bustling now, the streets filled with people going about their daily routines, oblivious to the drama that was about to unfold. As she approached the pier, she felt a growing sense of unease. The air was thick with the smell of salt water, fish, and coal smoke. The sounds of the harbor, the screech of gulls, the rumble of cranes, the shouts of dockworkers were a cacophony that amplified her anxiety. Pier 54 was a vast, sprawling structure, a maze of warehouses, loading docks, and ships. It was a place of constant motion, a place where people and goods from all over the world converged. It was also a place of secrets, a place where illicit deals were made, where spies and smugglers plied their trade. She arrived a few minutes before noon, her heart pounding in her chest. She scanned the crowd, looking for any sign of recognition, any indication of who she was supposed to meet. There were hundreds of people milling about, dockworkers, sailors, travelers, soldiers, a sea of faces, most of them hardened by the war, their eyes reflecting the weariness and cynicism of the times. She spotted a clock tower in the distance and made her way towards it, positioning herself in a spot where she could see anyone approaching. She waited, her hand resting on the reassuring weight of the pistol in her handbag, her senses on high alert. The minutes ticked by, each one an eternity. She felt exposed, vulnerable, a lone woman in a dangerous, male-dominated world. She fought back the urge to flee, to run back to the relative safety of her brownstone, to Henry. Then she saw him, a man, standing across the pier, near a stack of crates. He was tall, thin, wearing a dark coat and a hat that shadowed his face. He was looking directly at her. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't make any gesture of recognition. But she knew. It was him, the man she was supposed to meet. He slowly raised his hand, a single finger pointing towards a narrow alleyway between two warehouses. A silent invitation. A summons. Margaret took a deep breath, steeling herself. She had come this far. She couldn't turn back now. She walked towards the alleyway, her steps measured and deliberate, her eyes fixed on the man across the pier. He, in turn, melted back into the throng. The scars of this meeting, she knew, were just beginning to surface. Chapter 6. The Society Ball Deception. The alleyway was dark and damp, the smell of rotting fish and stagnant water overpowering. Margaret hesitated at the entrance, her senses on high alert. She could hear the sounds of the harbor behind her, the shouts of dockworkers, the rumble of machinery. But here, in this narrow passage, it was eerily quiet. She took a deep breath and stepped into the alleyway, her hand gripping the pistol in her handbag. She moved slowly, cautiously, her eyes scanning the shadows, her ears straining to pick up any sound. The man was waiting for her halfway down the alley, his back to her, his figure silhouetted against the faint light at the far end. He was still wearing the dark coat and hat, his face obscured. "You came," he said, his voice low and raspy, a voice she didn't recognize. "Who are you?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling slightly. "What do you want?" He turned slowly, and for a moment, she saw his face. It was a face she had seen before, but not here, not in this context. It was the face of Charles Barrington, a prominent lawyer, a friend of her father's, a man she had danced with at countless society balls. A man she had always considered to be a pillar of the community. "Charles?" she said, her voice a mixture of shock and disbelief. "What is the meaning of this?" He smiled, a cold, cynical smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "Let's just say I'm a friend of Henry's," he said. "A friend who knows more about his situation than you do." "What situation?" Margaret asked, her voice rising. "He's wounded. He needs help." "He's more than wounded, my dear," Barrington said, his smile widening. "He's a liability. To the army, to the government, to certain powerful individuals." "What are you talking about?" Margaret demanded. "What has he done?" Barrington took a step closer, his eyes boring into hers.
"He knows too much," he said.
"He saw things he shouldn't have seen. He heard things he shouldn't have heard. And he's talking." "Talking?" Margaret repeated, confused. "Talking to whom?" "To anyone who will listen," Barrington said. "He's become unstable." Unpredictable. Dangerous. Margaret felt a surge of anger.
He's been through hell, she said.
He's suffering. He needs help, not accusations. He needs to be silenced, Barrington said, his voice hardening. And you, my dear, are going to help us do it. Margaret's hand tightened around the pistol. I will do no such thing, she said. I will protect him. Barrington chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. You're in no position to protect anyone, Margaret, he said. You're playing a game you don't understand. A game with very high stakes. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, silver locket. It was Henry's locket, the one he always wore, the one that contained a miniature portrait of her. Recognize this? Barrington asked, dangling the locket in front of her. Margaret felt a wave of nausea. Where did you get that? She demanded. He gave it to me, Barrington said, as a token of his good faith. A sign that he was willing to cooperate. Cooperate? Margaret repeated. Cooperate with what? With our plans, Barrington said. Our plans to end the war. On our terms. Margaret stared at him, her mind reeling. This was madness. Charles Barrington a traitor? Henry, involved in some kind of conspiracy? It was all too much to comprehend. I don't believe you, she said, her voice shaking. Barrington shrugged. Believe what you want, he said. But the fact remains. Henry is a danger to us all. And he needs to be stopped. He paused, his eyes locking with hers. Tonight. At the Vandergelt ball. You will be there, won't you? Margaret's mind flashed to the invitation, sitting on her dressing table. The Vandergelts, one of the wealthiest families in New York, were hosting a lavish ball, a fundraiser for the war effort. She had planned to attend, before Henry's arrival had thrown her life into chaos. What does the ball have to do with this? She asked. It's the perfect opportunity, Barrington said. A chance to neutralize him. Without raising suspicion. He smiled again, that same cold, unsettling smile. You will help us, Margaret. Or you will both suffer the consequences. He tossed the locket to her feet. It landed with a soft thud on the damp cobblestones. The deception, she realized, was far more elaborate than she could have ever imagined. The ball. It was all a carefully orchestrated stage. Chapter 7. The Secret of the Silver Locket. Margaret retrieved the locket, her fingers closing around the cold metal. It felt heavier than she remembered, imbued with a new, sinister significance. She opened it, her thumb brushing against the catch, and gazed at the miniature portrait of herself, a faded image of a happier, more innocent time. The locket. Henry had never taken it off, not even in the trenches, he had told her. It was his talisman, his connection to her, to home, to everything he was fighting for. And now, it was in the hands of a traitor, a man who was using it to manipulate her, to threaten her, to force her into an impossible situation. She closed the locket, the click echoing in the narrow alleyway. She looked up at Barrington, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and defiance. I will go to the ball, she said, her voice steady now, her fear replaced by a cold, hard resolve. But I will not betray Henry. Barrington raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his eyes. We shall see, my dear, he said. We shall see. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows at the far end of the alleyway. Margaret stood there for a moment, listening to his receding footsteps, her mind racing. She had to warn Henry. She had to find a way to expose Barrington, to stop him from carrying out his plan. She left the alleyway, emerging back into the chaos of the pier, her senses on high alert. She felt like she was being watched, followed, surrounded by enemies. She hailed a cab and gave the driver her address, her mind already working on a plan. As the cab sped through the streets, she examined the locket again, turning it over and over in her hands. Something about it felt different besides the weight. She ran her finger along the edge, feeling a slight irregularity, a tiny gap between the front and back covers. She carefully pried the locket open, using a hairpin she found in her handbag. It was difficult, the catch stiff and resistant, but finally, with a snap, it opened. Inside, nestled beneath the portrait of herself, was another compartment, a hidden recess that she had never known existed. And inside that compartment was a small, folded piece of paper. Her heart pounding, she carefully unfolded the paper. It was a note, written in Henry's familiar handwriting, but the words were not addressed to her. They were addressed to someone else, someone identified only by the initial T. T, the information you requested is enclosed. Barrington is the key. He is working with the Germans. The meeting is at the Vandergelt ball. I have proof. Be careful. They know I'm talking. H.W. Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her, followed by a surge of adrenaline. Henry wasn't a traitor. He was a hero. He was trying to expose Barrington, to stop his plot, to save the country. The note explained everything. The telegrams, the fingerprint, Pier 54, the ball, it was all part of Henry's plan, a desperate attempt to get the information to the right person, to T. But who is T? Her mind immediately went to her brother, Thomas. The journalist. The muckraker. The man who had a knack for uncovering secrets and a deep-seated distrust of authority. It had to be him. She had to get to Thomas, to show him the note, to enlist his help. He was the only one she could trust. He was the only one who could expose Barrington and save Henry. The cab pulled up in front of her brownstone. She paid the driver and rushed inside, her mind racing. She had to find Thomas. She had to act quickly. The ball was tonight. Time was running out. The locket, she realized, wasn't a symbol of betrayal, it was a lifeline, a desperate message from a man trapped in a web of deceit. And she was the only one who could deliver it. The secret within the silver was now her weapon. Chapter 8. Midnight Confessions in Central Park. Margaret found Henry awake, but weak and disoriented. He struggled to sit up, his eyes clouded with pain and confusion. She quickly explained the situation, showing him the note she had found in the locket, her words tumbling out in a rush of urgency and fear. He listened intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. As she spoke, a flicker of recognition, of understanding, returned to his eyes. Thomas, he whispered, his voice raspy. You have to get to Thomas.
I know, she said.
I'm going to him now. But I need to know everything, Henry. Everything you know about Barrington, about the Germans, about the plot. He nodded, his eyes closing for a moment as he gathered his strength. He began to speak, his voice low and hesitant, pausing frequently to catch his breath. He told her about his time in France, about the horrors he had witnessed, the senseless slaughter, the corruption and incompetence of the High Command. He told her about how he had stumbled upon a secret meeting, a clandestine gathering of officers and civilians, including Barrington, discussing plans to sabotage the American war effort to negotiate a separate peace with Germany. He had gathered evidence, documents, photographs, enough to expose the entire conspiracy. But he had been discovered. He had been wounded, captured, and then, miraculously, he had escaped, making his way back to the United States with the help of a network of sympathetic soldiers and civilians. He had sent the telegrams, using the fingerprint as a way to identify himself to Thomas, a code they had used as children. He had chosen Pier 54 as a meeting place, a place where he could blend in with the crowds, a place where he could hopefully pass the information to his contact. But Barrington had intercepted him, had taken the locket, had threatened him, had forced him to cooperate. He had played along, pretending to betray his country, in order to buy time, to find a way to get the truth out. The ball, he said, his voice weakening. It's a trap. They're planning to eliminate me. And anyone else who knows the truth. Margaret felt a surge of fear, but also a renewed determination. She would not let them win. She would protect Henry. She would expose Barrington. She would save the country. I have to go, she said, standing up. I have to get to Thomas. He reached out and grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. Be careful, Margaret, he said. They're ruthless. They won't hesitate to. He didn't finish the sentence, but she understood. They wouldn't hesitate to kill her. She squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with tears. I will, she said. I promise. And I'll come back. For you. She left the brownstone, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't go to Thomas's apartment. Not directly. It was too risky. She needed a place where they could meet in secret, a place where they wouldn't be seen. She decided on Central Park, a vast, sprawling oasis in the heart of the city, a place where they could blend in with the crowds, a place where they could talk without being overheard. She sent a message to Thomas, using a prearranged code they had devised years ago, telling him to meet her at midnight, near the Bethesda fountain. The hours that followed were agonizing. She paced the floor of her apartment, her nerves on edge, her mind constantly replaying Henry's story, Barrington's threats, the impending danger of the ball. She checked on Henry frequently, finding him asleep, his breathing still labored, but his fever seemingly reduced. As midnight approached, she slipped out of the house, unnoticed, and made her way to Central Park. The park was dark and quiet, the only sounds the rustling of leaves, the hooting of an owl, the distant rumble of the city. She arrived at the Bethesda fountain, a magnificent structure, its angel statue shimmering in the moonlight. She waited, her heart pounding, her eyes scanning the shadows. Then she saw him. Thomas emerged from the darkness, his figure tall and lean, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. He looked like a character from one of his own stories, a mysterious figure lurking in the shadows. "Margaret?" he said, his voice low and cautious. "Thomas," she replied, relief flooding through her. They embraced, a brief, desperate hug that conveyed the years of unspoken affection and shared secrets. She quickly explained the situation, showing him the note, telling him about Henry, about Barrington, about the plot. He listened intently, his eyes narrowing, his jaw tightening. "I knew it," he said, his voice filled with anger. "I knew there was something rotten at the core. I just couldn't prove it." "We have proof now," Margaret said, holding up the locket. "Henry's proof. And we have to use it. Tonight. At the ball." They made a plan, a desperate gamble, a dangerous scheme that could cost them their lives. But they had no choice. They had to stop Barrington. They had to save Henry. They had to expose the truth. As they talked, the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky, a pale, watery light that offered a glimmer of hope in the darkness. The confessions shared in the heart of the city, under the cloak of a moonlit night, set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. The clock was ticking, faster now. Chapter 9. The Price of Loyalty. The hours leading up to the Vandergelt ball were a blur of frantic preparation and mounting tension. Margaret and Thomas worked together, refining their plan, gathering the necessary resources, and preparing themselves for the confrontation that awaited them. Thomas, using his contacts in the newspaper world, managed to secure a pass for the ball, a coveted invitation that would allow him to enter the exclusive gathering undetected. He also arranged for a photographer, a trusted colleague, to be present, discreetly documenting the events, ready to capture any evidence of Barrington's treachery. Margaret, meanwhile, focused on her own preparations. She chose a gown that was both elegant and practical, a deep blue silk that would allow her to move freely, with a hidden pocket sewn into the lining, large enough to conceal the locket and the pistol. She practiced her demeanor, rehearsing the role she would have to play, the innocent society woman, oblivious to the danger that lurked beneath the surface. She visited Henry, finding him awake, but still weak. She told him about her plan, about Thomas's involvement, about their determination to expose Barrington. He listened intently, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Be careful, Margaret," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please. Don't underestimate him." "I won't," she promised, squeezing his hand. "We'll do this together. We'll get through this." As evening approached, she dressed carefully, her movements deliberate, her mind focused on the task ahead. She looked at herself in the mirror, her reflection a stranger, a woman transformed by circumstance, a woman forced to play a dangerous game. She left the brownstone, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert. She hailed a cab, giving the driver the address of the Vandergelt mansion, a sprawling estate on Fifth Avenue, overlooking Central Park. The mansion was ablaze with light, the sounds of music and laughter spilling out into the night. Carriages and motor cars lined the street, disgorging elegantly dressed guests, a parade of wealth and privilege, oblivious to the drama that was about to unfold. Margaret entered the ballroom, her pass granting her access to the glittering throng. The room was a sea of silk gowns, sparkling jewels, and tailored suits, a spectacle of opulence and extravagance. The air was thick with the scent of perfume, champagne, and the underlying tension of wartime anxieties. She scanned the crowd, looking for Barrington, for Thomas, for any sign of danger. She spotted Thomas across the room, talking to a group of journalists, his demeanor casual, his eyes watchful. She saw Barrington, too, standing near the orchestra, his face a mask of civility, his eyes betraying a hint of nervousness. She moved through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with acquaintances, playing the role of the innocent society woman, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt like a spy in enemy territory, surrounded by potential threats, unsure of who to trust. She approached Barrington, her smile forced, her voice steady. "Charles," she said, extending her hand. "A lovely party, isn't it?" He took her hand, his grip firm, his eyes searching hers. "Margaret," he said, his voice smooth, his smile unwavering. "I'm glad you could make it." "I wouldn't miss it for the world," she said, her voice dripping with irony. "Especially after our conversation this afternoon." His smile faltered slightly, his eyes narrowing. "I trust you've given some thought to what I said," he said, his voice low, his words a veiled threat. "I have," she replied, her voice equally low. "And I've decided to cooperate." He smiled again, a triumphant smile that sent a shiver down her spine. "I knew you would see reason, my dear," he said. "You're a smart woman, Margaret. You know what's best for you and for Henry." He led her towards a secluded alcove, away from the noise and the crowds.
"We need to talk," he said.
"About the arrangements." As they reached the alcove, Margaret saw Thomas approaching, his photographer discreetly following behind. This was it. The moment of truth. The price of loyalty, she knew, was about to be paid. But by whom? Chapter 10. Letters from a Lost Brother. "The arrangements are quite simple," Barrington began, his voice low and confidential, his eyes scanning the room to ensure they weren't being overheard. "You will create a distraction, something dramatic that will draw attention away from Henry. My men will then escort him to a waiting car. He will be taken to a safe location, where he'll be dealt with." Margaret felt a surge of anger, but she forced herself to remain calm, to play the role she had rehearsed. "And what kind of distraction did you have in mind?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of curiosity. Barrington smiled, a cruel, calculating smile that sent a chill down her spine. "Something memorable," he said. "Something that will make people talk. Something that will discredit him completely." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, sealed envelope. "These letters," he said, handing her the envelope. "They are from Henry's brother, Edward. You know, the one who died at the Somme?" Margaret nodded, her heart sinking. She knew about Edward, Henry's younger brother, a bright, promising young man who had been killed in action 2 years earlier. Henry had been devastated by his death, blaming himself for not being able to protect him. "These letters," Barrington continued, "contain sensitive information. Information that would damage Henry's reputation irreparably. Information that would implicate him in Edward's death." Margaret felt a wave of nausea. This was beyond cruel. This was monstrous. Barrington was using Henry's grief, his guilt, his love for his brother, against him. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm suggesting that you read these letters," Barrington said, his voice hardening. "Read them aloud. To everyone. Let them hear the truth about their beloved Sergeant Whittaker. Let them see him for what he really is, a coward, a traitor, a murderer." Margaret stared at him, her mind reeling. She couldn't do it. She wouldn't betray Henry like that, even to save his life. It was too much. It was unthinkable. She looked across the room, her eyes searching for Thomas. She saw him, standing near the entrance to the alcove, his photographer poised, ready to capture the moment. She had to make a decision.
Now.
She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I will not read these letters," she said, her voice firm, her eyes blazing with defiance. "I will not betray Henry. And I will not let you get away with this." Barrington's smile vanished, replaced by a look of fury. "You foolish woman," he hissed. "You have no idea what you're doing. You're signing your own death warrant." "Perhaps," she said, her voice steady, "but I will die knowing that I did the right thing, that I stood by the man I love, that I fought for what I believe in." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the locket, holding it up for Barrington to see. "This," she said, "contains the truth. The truth about you, about your conspiracy, about your treachery. And my brother, Thomas, is about to share it with the world." As she spoke, Thomas stepped forward, his photographer snapping pictures, capturing Barrington's reaction, the shock, the anger, the fear that flickered across his face. "Charles Barrington," Thomas said, his voice loud and clear, ringing out across the ballroom. "You are under arrest. For treason. For conspiracy. For the attempted murder of Sergeant Henry Whitaker." The room fell silent, the music stopping abruptly, the guests turning to stare at the unfolding drama. Barrington, caught off guard, his carefully constructed facade crumbling, looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. The letters, meant to be Henry's undoing, were now mere props in a much larger play. A play for truth, for justice, for the soul of a nation at war. And Margaret, standing tall and defiant, held the key to it all. The lost brother's words, ironically, served to illuminate the present, rather than condemn the past. Chapter 11. The Spy Among Us. The chaos erupted. Guests screamed, some fainted, others rushed towards the exits, desperate to escape the unfolding drama. Barrington, realizing he was trapped, made a desperate move. He lunged towards Margaret, his hand reaching inside his coat, presumably for a weapon. But Thomas was faster. He intercepted Barrington, tackling him to the ground, the two men wrestling fiercely on the polished ballroom floor. The photographer continued to snap pictures, capturing the struggle, the desperate fight for control. Margaret, momentarily stunned, quickly regained her composure. She saw several men, Barrington's accomplices, moving towards them, their faces grim, their intentions clear. They were going to try to rescue Barrington, to silence them all. She reached into her handbag and pulled out the pistol, her hand trembling slightly. She had never fired a gun before, but she knew she had to act. She had to protect Thomas, protect Henry, protect the truth. She pointed the pistol at the approaching men, her voice loud and clear, surprisingly steady. "Stop right there," she commanded. "Don't move a muscle, or I swear I'll shoot." The men hesitated, surprised by her boldness, by the unexpected resistance. They were used to dealing with helpless women, with frightened civilians, not with a woman who was willing to fight, to kill, to defend what she believed in. Meanwhile, Thomas had managed to subdue Barrington, pinning him to the ground, his arm twisted behind his back. Barrington was cursing, spitting, his face contorted with rage and frustration. "You'll never get away with this," he hissed. "My friends, they're everywhere. They'll silence you all." "Your friends are finished, Barrington," Thomas said, his voice grim. "Your conspiracy is over. You're going to jail. And you're going to pay for your crimes." Just then, a group of men in uniform burst into the ballroom, their weapons drawn. They were military police, alerted by Thomas's contacts in the War Department, informed of the plot and the impending arrest. They quickly took control of the situation, arresting Barrington and his accomplices, restoring order to the chaotic scene. The guests, relieved that the danger had passed, began to murmur among themselves, their initial fear replaced by a mixture of curiosity and excitement. Margaret, her hand still gripping the pistol, felt the wave of exhaustion wash over her. She had done it. She had faced her fear. She had confronted the enemy. She had protected the man she loved. She lowered the pistol, her hand shaking, her body trembling with reaction. Thomas approached her, his face bruised and bleeding, but his eyes filled with pride and admiration. "You were amazing, Margaret," he said, embracing her. You saved us all. You saved Henry. She leaned against him, her body weak, her emotions overwhelming. She had never felt so scared, so vulnerable, so alive. As the military police led Barrington away, he turned to Margaret, his eyes filled with hatred. This isn't over, he spat. You may have won this battle, but you haven't won the war. There are others who will carry on the fight. Others who will avenge me. His words sent a chill down her spine, a reminder that the danger was not yet over. There were still spies, still traitors, still enemies lurking in the shadows. The war was far from over, both the external war raging in Europe and the internal war being fought in the hearts and minds of the American people. But for now, at least, they had won a victory. They had exposed Barrington, they had stopped his plot, they had saved Henry. And they had done it together. The spy among them had been unmasked, but the whispers of others, of a larger network, lingered in the air. The ballroom, once a scene of glittering celebration, was now a testament to the hidden battles fought beneath the surface of a nation at war. Margaret knew, with a sinking feeling, that this was just the beginning. The war, in all its forms, was far from over. Chapter 12. Betrayal at the Grand Central Terminal. The aftermath of the ball was a whirlwind of activity. The newspapers were filled with the story of Barrington's arrest, the details of his conspiracy, the heroism of Margaret and Thomas. They were hailed as heroes, patriots, saviors of the nation. Henry, still recovering from his wounds, was placed under military protection, his testimony crucial to the ongoing investigation. He was cleared of all suspicion, his name restored, his honor vindicated. Margaret, exhausted but exhilarated, returned to her brownstone, the events of the past few days replaying in her mind like a surreal dream. She had faced her fears. She had confronted the enemy. She had saved the man she loved. But Barrington's words, his threat of vengeance, his warning of others who would carry on the fight, continued to haunt her. She knew the danger was not yet over. She knew there were still loose ends, still unanswered questions, still enemies lurking in the shadows. A few days after the ball, she received a message from Thomas. He had uncovered new information, a lead that could potentially expose the rest of Barrington's network. He needed her help. He asked her to meet him at Grand Central Terminal, a place where they could blend in with the crowds, a place where they could talk without being overheard. He told her to come alone, to trust no one, to be careful. Margaret, her instinct screaming danger, agreed to the meeting. She knew it was risky, but she couldn't ignore the possibility of uncovering the truth, of finally putting an end to the conspiracy. She arrived at Grand Central Terminal, her heart pounding, her senses on high alert. The terminal was a vast, sprawling space, a cathedral of transportation, filled with the hustle and bustle of travelers, soldiers, and commuters. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke, coffee, and the underlying tension of wartime anxieties. She scanned the crowd, looking for Thomas, her eyes darting from face to face. She spotted him near the information booth, his back to her, his figure partially obscured by a group of soldiers. She approached him cautiously, her hand resting on the reassuring weight of the pistol in her handbag. As she drew closer, she felt a growing sense of unease. Something wasn't right. "Thomas?" she said, her voice low, her eyes searching his face. He turned slowly, and for a moment, she saw his face. It wasn't Thomas. It was someone else, someone she had never seen before, a man with cold, hard eyes and a cruel smile. "You're not Thomas," she said, her voice a mixture of shock and fear. The man smiled, a chilling smile that sent a shiver down her spine.
"No, my dear," he said.
"I'm not. But I have a message for you. From Mr. Barrington." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, familiar object. It was Henry's silver locket, the one she had thought was safely hidden in her brother's possession for publication. Margaret felt a wave of nausea. How had he gotten it? Had Thomas been captured? Had he been betrayed? "Where is my brother?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Your brother is indisposed," he said. "He won't be bothering us anymore. He took a step closer, his eyes boring into hers. "Mr. Barrington sends his regards," he said. "And he wants you to know that he always keeps his promises." He lunged towards her, his hand reaching for her throat. Margaret reacted instinctively, pulling out the pistol and firing. The shot echoed through the vast terminal, silencing the crowds, drawing the attention of everyone nearby. The man staggered backward, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with shock and pain. He collapsed to the floor, a pool of blood spreading around him. Margaret stood there, her hand still gripping the pistol, her body trembling with reaction. She had killed a man. She had taken a life. She had never thought herself capable of such violence. But she had no regrets.
She had acted in self-defense.
She had protected herself. She had avenged her brother, or so she believed. The terminal erupted in chaos. People screamed, ran for cover. Soldiers and police officers rushed towards the scene. Margaret, amidst the turmoil, knew she had to escape. She had to get to Henry. She had to warn him. She slipped through the crowd, unnoticed, her face hidden by her hat, her heart pounding in her chest. The betrayal, she realized, cut deeper than she could have imagined. Thomas lost. The locket gone. She was alone, again, facing an enemy she didn't fully understand. Grand Central, a place of comings and goings, had become a scene of permanent departure. And she was now, undeniably, a fugitive. Chapter 13. Echoes of gunfire in the library. Margaret fled Grand Central Terminal, her mind racing, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear, grief, and a desperate determination to survive. She hailed a cab, giving the driver a random address, far from her brownstone, far from anywhere she was known. She needed time to think, to plan, to figure out what to do next. She knew she couldn't go to the police. They would arrest her, question her, hold her in custody. She couldn't trust anyone. She was alone, hunted, a fugitive in her own city. As the cab sped through the streets, she replayed the events at the terminal, the man's face, his words, the locket. Thomas lost. The thought was unbearable. She had to believe he was still alive, that there was still a chance to save him. She remembered a place, a sanctuary, a place where she had spent countless hours as a child, a place where she could find solace, a place where she could think. The New York Public Library, a vast, imposing building on Fifth Avenue, a repository of knowledge, a refuge from the chaos of the outside world. She instructed the driver to take her to the library, her mind already working on a plan. She needed information. She needed to find out who the man at the terminal was, who he worked for, what Barrington's network was planning. She arrived at the library, her senses on high alert. She entered the building, the familiar smell of old books, leather, and paper calming her nerves. She moved through the grand halls, the hushed silence a stark contrast to the chaos she had just escaped. She found a secluded alcove in the reading room, a quiet corner where she could be alone, where she could think without being disturbed. She sat down at a table, her mind racing, her eyes scanning the room. She needed to access the library's archives, the newspaper files, the records of past events. She needed to find any information she could about Barrington, his associates, his connections. She needed to find a clue, a lead, anything that could help her understand the conspiracy, that could help her find Thomas. She approached one of the librarians, a stern-looking woman with spectacles perched on her nose. She asked for access to the archives, explaining that she was researching a historical project, a fictional story about wartime espionage. The librarian, initially skeptical, eventually relented, granting her access to the restricted section. She led Margaret to a dimly lit room, filled with rows upon rows of dusty files, old newspapers, and bound volumes. Margaret began her search, her fingers tracing the spines of the books, her eyes scanning the headlines of the newspapers. She worked quickly, efficiently, her mind focused on the task ahead. Hours passed, and she found nothing. She was beginning to despair, to lose hope. But then, she stumbled upon a file, a small, unassuming folder tucked away in a corner. It was labeled Barrington, Charles Correspondence. Her heart pounding, she opened the file. Inside were letters, telegrams, documents, all related to Barrington's business dealings, his political connections, his social activities. She scanned the documents, her eyes searching for any clue, any hint of his involvement in the conspiracy. Then she found it. A letter, dated several months earlier, addressed to Barrington from someone identified only by the initial R. The letter spoke of a plan, a meeting, a shipment, a target. It was cryptic, vague, but it was clearly connected to the conspiracy. And then she saw a name that made her blood run cold. A name that shattered everything she thought she knew. The name was her father's. The echoes of the gunfire from Grand Central seemed to reverberate in the silent library, the past and the present colliding in a devastating revelation. Her father. Involved? It was impossible. It couldn't be true. But the letter, the evidence, was there, in black and white, staring her in the face. She felt like the floor was giving way beneath her, the world spinning out of control. The library, once a sanctuary, had become a chamber of horrors, revealing a truth she was not prepared to face. The weight of the discovery pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. Chapter 14. The Promise Forged in Fear. Margaret sat there, stunned, the letter trembling in her hands. Her father. A traitor? It was incomprehensible, a betrayal that cut deeper than any she had ever imagined. The man she had admired, respected, loved, was part of the conspiracy, part of the plot to undermine the war effort, part of the danger that threatened Henry, that had cost Thomas his freedom, perhaps his life. She reread the letter, her mind struggling to make sense of the words, to reconcile the image of her father, the staunch patriot, the pillar of the community, with the reality of his secret life, his hidden treachery. The letter spoke of a meeting, a clandestine gathering of Barrington and his associates, to be held at a secluded location, a warehouse on the waterfront. The purpose of the meeting was to finalize the details of a shipment, a consignment of weapons and explosives, destined for a German U-boat lurking off the coast of Long Island. The target was not specified, but Margaret could guess. It was likely a troop transport, a ship carrying American soldiers to the battlefields of Europe. Her father's involvement was clear. He was providing the funds, the logistics, the cover for the operation. He was using his influence, his connections, his reputation, to facilitate the betrayal of his own country. Margaret felt a wave of nausea, a surge of anger, a profound sense of disillusionment. Everything she had believed in, everything she had trusted, was crumbling around her. She was alone, adrift in a sea of deceit, surrounded by enemies, betrayed by the one person she had thought she could always rely on. But amidst the despair, a spark of determination ignited within her. She would not let her father's treachery break her. She would not let Barrington win. She would not let Henry down. She would fight. She would expose the truth. She would save Thomas. She carefully copied the letter, concealing the copy in her handbag, replacing the original in the file. She left the library, her mind racing, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and resolve. She knew she couldn't confront her father directly. He was too powerful, too influential. He would deny everything, silence her, perhaps even harm her. She needed a plan. She needed allies. She needed help. She thought of Henry, still recovering in the military hospital, under protection, but vulnerable. She had to warn him. She had to tell him about her father, about the meeting, about the shipment. She decided to go to the hospital, risking exposure, risking capture, but determined to reach him, to share the information, to forge a plan together. As she walked towards the hospital, she felt a growing sense of unease. She was being followed. She could sense it, the presence of someone lurking in the shadows, watching her, tracking her movements. She quickened her pace, her hand gripping the pistol in her handbag, her senses on high alert. She knew she was in danger, that Barrington's network was closing in, that they were determined to silence her, to stop her from exposing the truth. She reached the hospital, her heart pounding, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She slipped inside unnoticed, blending in with the visitors, the nurses, the doctors. She found Henry's room, guarded by 2 military police officers. She approached them cautiously, explaining that she was his fiancée, that she had urgent information for him. The officers, initially skeptical, eventually relented, allowing her to enter the room. Henry was awake, but weak, his face pale, his eyes filled with concern. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice raspy. "What is it? What's happened?" She quickly explained everything, showing him the copy of the letter, telling him about her father, about the meeting, about the shipment. He listened intently, his eyes narrowing, his jaw tightening. "We have to stop them, Henry," she said, her voice filled with urgency. "We have to warn the authorities. We have to prevent that shipment from reaching the U-boat." He nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and determination.
"We will," he said.
"We'll do it together. But we need a plan. A plan that will expose them all, without risking innocent lives." They talked for hours, their voices low, their minds racing, forging a plan in the face of fear, a promise to fight for justice, to protect their country, to save each other. The hospital room, a place of healing, became a war room, a crucible where their love and loyalty would be tested to the limit. The promise, forged in fear, was their only weapon now. Chapter 15. Flight across the rooftops. Their plan was audacious, dangerous, and their only hope. Henry, despite his weakened condition, insisted on being involved. He knew the details of Barrington's operation, the layout of the warehouse, the identities of the key players. His knowledge was crucial to their success. Margaret, despite her reservations about his health, agreed. She knew they needed him. She knew they were stronger together. They decided to contact the only person they could still trust, a high-ranking officer in the War Department, General John Pershing himself. Henry had served under Pershing in France and knew him to be a man of integrity, a patriot who would not tolerate treason. Using a secure telephone line in the hospital, Henry managed to reach Pershing, briefly explaining the situation, the evidence they had uncovered, the impending shipment. Pershing, initially skeptical, was quickly convinced by Henry's sincerity and the urgency of his tone. He promised to mobilize his forces, to intercept the shipment, to arrest the conspirators. But Pershing warned them. Barrington's network was extensive, reaching into the highest levels of government and the military. They couldn't trust anyone. They had to be careful. They had to be prepared for anything. Henry and Margaret knew they had to get out of the hospital to avoid being captured by Barrington's men. They knew they were being watched, that their every move was being monitored. They devised a daring escape plan. Using a back staircase, rarely used and poorly guarded, they would make their way to the roof of the hospital. From there, they would cross over to the adjacent building, a warehouse that was connected to the waterfront, the very location where the meeting was to be held. It was a risky plan, fraught with danger, but they had no choice. They had to reach the warehouse, to gather more evidence, to witness the meeting, to expose the conspirators to Pershing's forces. As darkness fell, they put their plan into action. Margaret, disguised as a nurse, helped Henry, still weak but determined, to navigate the corridors of the hospital, avoiding detection. They reached the back staircase, their hearts pounding, their senses on high alert. They climbed the stairs, slowly, cautiously, their every step echoing in the silent stairwell. They reached the roof, the cold night air stinging their faces. The city skyline stretched out before them, a panorama of lights and shadows, a vast, sprawling labyrinth of danger and opportunity. They moved quickly, silently, across the rooftop, their figures silhouetted against the night sky. They reached the edge of the roof, looking down at the adjacent building, the warehouse, their destination. The gap between the two buildings was significant, a chasm of darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. But there was a narrow ledge, a precarious pathway that connected the two roofs. Henry, his strength waning, hesitated. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice filled with doubt. "I don't know if I can." She squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with determination. "You can, Henry," she said. "We can do this. Together." She took the lead, Stepping onto the ledge, her body pressed against the wall of the building, her hands gripping the rough brick. She moved slowly, cautiously, her every step a test of balance, a defiance of gravity. Henry followed, his movements unsteady, his breathing labored. He stumbled, his foot slipping on the narrow ledge. Margaret reached out, grabbing his arm, pulling him back from the brink. "I've got you, Henry," she said, her voice trembling. "Just hold on." They continued their perilous journey across the rooftops, the city lights twinkling below them, the wind whipping their hair, the fear gnawing at their insides. They were exposed, vulnerable, targets for anyone who might be watching. But they pressed on, driven by their love, their loyalty, their determination to survive, to expose the truth, to save their country. The flight across the rooftops was a metaphor for their entire struggle, a precarious balancing act between hope and despair, between life and death. And they were determined to reach the other side. The warehouse awaited. Chapter 16. The safe house in Greenwich Village. They made it across the rooftops, their bodies exhausted, their nerves frayed, but their spirits unbroken. They reached the warehouse, finding a fire escape that led down to a narrow alleyway, a dark, secluded passage that reeked of garbage and decay. They descended the fire escape, their movements slow and cautious, their eyes scanning the shadows, their ears straining to pick up any sound. They reached the ground, their feet touching the damp cobblestones, the alleyway silent and ominous. They knew they couldn't stay in the open. They needed a safe place, a place to rest, to regroup, to plan their next move. They needed a place where they could hide from Barrington's network, from the authorities, from anyone who might be looking for them. Margaret remembered a place, a small, unassuming apartment in Greenwich Village, a safe house used by her brother, Thomas, for his clandestine meetings, his journalistic investigations. It was a place known only to a few trusted individuals, a place where they could hopefully find refuge. They made their way to Greenwich Village, avoiding the main streets, sticking to the back alleys, the hidden pathways, the shadows of the city. They moved like ghosts, invisible, silent, their every step a testament to their desperation and their determination. They reached the apartment building, a nondescript structure on a quiet, tree-lined street. Margaret found the hidden key, concealed beneath a loose brick in the entryway. She opened the door, her hand trembling, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. They entered the apartment, the air stale and musty, the silence heavy and expectant. It was a small, sparsely furnished space, a single room with a bed, a table, a few chairs, and a small kitchenette. It was not luxurious, but it was safe, a temporary haven from the storm that raged outside. Henry collapsed onto the bed, his body exhausted, his breathing labored. Margaret checked his wounds, rebandaging his arm, her touch gentle and caring. He was weak, but his spirit remained strong, his determination unwavering. They spent the night in the safe house, their bodies huddled together for warmth, their minds racing with plans and possibilities. They knew they couldn't stay there long. Barrington's network was vast, their resources extensive. They would be found eventually. They decided to use the apartment as a base of operations, a place to gather information, to contact Pershing, to prepare for their final confrontation with Barrington and his conspirators. Margaret managed to find a working telephone in the apartment, a rare commodity in those days. She contacted Pershing, updating him on their situation, their location, their plan to infiltrate the warehouse meeting. Pershing, relieved that they were still alive, promised to provide support, to send a team of his most trusted soldiers to assist them. But he warned them again. Barrington was dangerous, ruthless, and he would stop at nothing to protect his operation. Henry, despite his weakness, insisted on accompanying Margaret to the warehouse. He knew the layout, the security measures, the identities of the key players. His knowledge was essential to their success. Margaret, her heart filled with a mixture of love and fear, agreed. She knew they were stronger together. She knew they had to face this final challenge, this ultimate test, as one. The safe house in Greenwich Village, a temporary refuge, became their command center, their war room, a place where they would plan their final assault on the conspiracy, a place where they would fight for their lives, for their love, for their country. The quiet street outside, oblivious to the drama unfolding within, was a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside the small, unassuming apartment. They were ready. Chapter 17. Unmasking the Enemy Within. The following day was spent in intense preparation. Margaret and Henry, using the limited resources available in the safe house, gathered information, made contacts, and finalized their plan to infiltrate the warehouse meeting and expose Barrington's conspiracy. Henry, drawing on his knowledge of the waterfront and its clandestine activities, identified the likely location of the warehouse, a dilapidated building near Pier 54, the same pier where Margaret had first encountered Barrington. It was a place of shadows, secrets, and illicit dealings, a perfect setting for the conspirators' final act of betrayal. Margaret, using her contacts in the city, managed to secure a small but powerful listening device, a new technology that could record conversations from a distance. It was a risky proposition, requiring her to get close to the meeting, to plant the device without being detected, but it was their best chance to gather irrefutable evidence of the conspiracy. They also received confirmation from Pershing that his team of soldiers was in place, ready to move in on their signal, to arrest Barrington and his associates, to prevent the shipment of weapons from reaching the German U-boat. As evening approached, they prepared to leave the safe house, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. They knew the risks were enormous, the chances of success slim, but they were determined to see it through, to fight for their lives, for their love, for their country. Margaret, dressed in a nondescript outfit that would allow her to blend in with the dock workers and sailors of the waterfront, concealed the listening device in her handbag, along with the pistol she had carried since her encounter at Grand Central Terminal. Henry, still weak but determined, insisted on carrying a small, concealed knife, his only weapon against the heavily armed conspirators. He knew he was a liability, that his physical condition put them both at risk, but he refused to stay behind, to let Margaret face the danger alone. They left the safe house, slipping out into the darkness, their figures merging with the shadows of the city. They moved quickly, silently, towards the waterfront, their every step a testament to their courage and their commitment. They reached the warehouse, a dark, imposing structure that loomed over the surrounding buildings. They could hear the sounds of activity inside, the murmur of voices, the clatter of machinery, the signs of the impending meeting. Margaret, using her knowledge of the building's layout, gained access through a side entrance, a rarely used door that led to a narrow corridor, a secret passage that would take them close to the main meeting room. They moved cautiously, silently, through the dimly lit corridor, their senses on high alert, their every step fraught with danger. They could hear the voices getting louder, the conversation becoming clearer, the details of the conspiracy unfolding before them. They reached a small, hidden alcove, overlooking the main meeting room. Margaret carefully positioned the listening device, concealing it behind a stack of crates, ensuring it was within range of the conversation. They could see Barrington, standing at the head of a large table, surrounded by his associates, a group of men in expensive suits and military uniforms, their faces grim, their intentions clear. They were discussing the final details of the shipment, the timing, the location, the signal that would alert the U-boat. And then Margaret saw him, her father, sitting at the table, next to Barrington, his face a mask of cold calculation, his voice betraying no hint of remorse, no sign of the love he had once shown her. He was an active participant in the conspiracy, a key player in the plot to betray his country. The sight of him, the reality of his treachery, hit her with the force of a physical blow. She felt a wave of nausea, a surge of anger, a profound sense of betrayal. But she forced herself to remain calm, to focus on the task ahead. She whispered to Henry, her voice trembling, "It's him. My father. He's here." Henry, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and understanding, squeezed her hand. "We'll get through this, Margaret," he whispered. Together, they listened to the conversation, recording the incriminating evidence, the details of the plot, the names of the conspirators. They had what they needed. They had the proof. But as they prepared to leave, to signal Pershing's forces, a voice rang out, a voice that froze them in their tracks. "I believe we have some uninvited guests," Barrington said, his voice loud and clear, his eyes scanning the room. He knew. Somehow he knew they were there. The enemy, they realized, had been within their own family all along. The unmasking was complete, and the consequences were about to unfold. Chapter 18. A desperate gamble. Barrington's words hung in the air, a chilling pronouncement that shattered the fragile hope Margaret and Henry had clung to. They were trapped, exposed, their carefully laid plan unraveling before their eyes. Barrington's men, alerted by his signal, began to search the warehouse, their movements swift and efficient, their weapons drawn. They were closing in, their footsteps echoing in the narrow corridor, their voices growing louder. Margaret and Henry knew they had to act quickly. They had to escape, to alert Pershing, to stop the shipment. But their options were limited, their escape routes blocked. "We have to fight," Henry whispered, his voice grim, his hand reaching for the knife concealed beneath his coat. Margaret, her heart pounding, her mind racing, knew he was right. They had no choice. They had to fight their way out, to buy themselves time, to give Pershing's forces a chance to intervene. She pulled out the pistol, her hand trembling slightly, her finger resting on the trigger. She had fired the gun once before, at Grand Central Terminal, but the thought of using it again, of taking a life, filled her with dread. But she had no choice. She had to protect Henry. She had to protect herself. She had to fight for their survival. As Barrington's men approached the alcove, Henry stepped forward, his knife drawn, his body tensed, ready to strike. Margaret, her pistol aimed, stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the approaching figures. The first man entered the alcove, his weapon raised, his face grim. Henry lunged, his knife slashing across the man's arm, forcing him to drop his weapon. Margaret fired, the shot echoing through the warehouse, the bullet hitting the man in the shoulder. He screamed, falling to the ground, clutching his wound. The other men, alerted by the gunfire, rushed towards the alcove, their weapons blazing. A fierce firefight erupted, the narrow corridor filled with the sounds of gunfire, the screams of the wounded, the shouts of the combatants. Margaret and Henry fought back, desperately, their movements coordinated, their skills honed by their shared experience, their love for each other fueling their determination. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, their situation increasingly desperate. Henry, weakened by his wounds, was struggling to keep up, his movements slowing, his strength fading. Margaret saw one of Barrington's men aiming at Henry, his finger tightening on the trigger. She reacted instinctively, throwing herself in front of Henry, shielding him with her body. The shot rang out, the bullet hitting her in the shoulder, the force of the impact throwing her to the ground. She cried out, pain searing through her body, her vision blurring. Henry, seeing her fall, roared with rage, attacking the man who had shot her, his knife finding its mark, silencing the man forever. He knelt beside Margaret, his face filled with anguish, his hands desperately trying to staunch the flow of blood. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Stay with me. Please. Stay with me." She looked at him, her eyes filled with love, her voice weak but steady. I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. We'll get through this together." Just then, they heard the sounds of sirens, the roar of engines, the shouts of soldiers. Pershing's forces had arrived. The remaining conspirators, realizing they were surrounded, surrendered, their weapons dropping to the floor, their faces filled with defeat. The firefight was over. Soldiers rushed into the alcove, their weapons drawn, their faces grim. They saw Margaret, lying on the ground, bleeding, Henry kneeling beside her, his face a mask of grief and desperation. They quickly assessed the situation, calling for medics, securing the area, arresting the remaining conspirators. The warehouse, once a scene of clandestine activity, was now a scene of chaos and confusion, the aftermath of a desperate gamble that had almost cost them everything. Margaret, her vision fading, her body growing cold, felt a sense of peace, a sense of acceptance. She had fought her fight. She had done her best. She had loved, and she had been loved. She looked at Henry, her eyes filled with a love that transcended the pain, the fear, the darkness that was closing in. "I love you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Then everything went black. The gamble, it seemed, had been lost. But the game, perhaps, was not yet over. Chapter 19. The Long Road to Redemption. Margaret awoke to the sterile smell of antiseptic and the muffled sounds of a hospital. She was lying in a bed, her body aching, her shoulder bandaged, her mind groggy and confused. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced her back down. A nurse, seeing her stir, approached the bed, her face kind and concerned. "You're awake," she said, her voice gentle. "How are you feeling?" Where am I?" Margaret asked, her voice weak and raspy. What happened?" "You're in the military hospital," the nurse replied. "You were shot. You've been unconscious for several days." "Henry," Margaret said, her voice filled with urgency. "Where's Henry? Is he all right?" The nurse hesitated, her eyes clouding with a mixture of sympathy and uncertainty.
He's alive," she said.
"But he's in a critical condition. He lost a lot of blood. He's fighting for his life." Margaret felt a surge of fear, a wave of despair. Henry, fighting for his life. It was her fault. She had thrown herself in front of him. She had taken the bullet. She had put him in danger. I need to see him," she said, her voice trembling. The nurse shook her head. "I'm sorry," she said. "He's not stable enough for visitors. The doctors are doing everything they can.
You need to rest.
You need to recover." Margaret, her heart aching, her mind racing, knew she couldn't rest. She couldn't lie there, helpless, while Henry was fighting for his life. She had to see him. She had to be with him. Over the next few days, she slowly regained her strength, her body healing, her mind gradually clearing. She learned the details of what had happened at the warehouse, the arrest of Barrington and his associates, the prevention of the shipment, the exposure of the conspiracy. She also learned about her father. He had been arrested, charged with treason, his reputation ruined, his life shattered. He had refused to speak, to cooperate with the authorities, to explain his actions. He was a broken man, a shadow of his former self. Margaret felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and a profound sense of betrayal. She couldn't understand how her father, the man she had admired and loved, could have been involved in such treachery. She couldn't forgive him. She couldn't forget. She finally convinced the doctors to allow her to see Henry. He was lying in a bed, his face pale and gaunt, his body covered in bandages, his breathing shallow and ragged. He was hooked up to machines, monitors beeping, tubes running in and out of his body. She sat beside him, holding his hand, her heart aching with a mixture of love and fear. She talked to him, whispered words of encouragement, told him about her recovery, about the arrest of the conspirators, about her father. She didn't know if he could hear her, if he could understand, but she needed to talk, to connect with him, to let him know that she was there, that she loved him, that she would never leave him. Days turned into weeks, and Henry slowly began to improve. He regained consciousness, his eyes flickering open, focusing on Margaret with a mixture of recognition and relief. He was weak, frail, but his spirit remained strong, his determination unwavering. He underwent several surgeries, his body slowly mending, his wounds gradually healing. He faced a long and difficult recovery, but he was alive, and he was fighting. Margaret stayed by his side, day and night, supporting him, encouraging him, loving him. They talked, they reminisced, they planned for the future, a future that was uncertain, but filled with hope. The long road to redemption was paved with pain, loss, and the slow, arduous process of healing. But they were walking it together, their love a beacon in the darkness, their courage a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The war had taken its toll, but it had not broken them. They had survived. They had overcome. And they had each other. Chapter 20. Dawn over the Hudson. Months passed, the seasons changing, the war finally drawing to a close. The armistice was signed. The guns fell silent. The world began the long and difficult process of healing and rebuilding. Henry, his recovery slow but steady, was discharged from the hospital, his body scarred but his spirit unbroken. He and Margaret returned to her brownstone, their home, a place that held both painful memories and the promise of a new beginning. They faced a changed world, a world scarred by war, a world struggling to come to terms with the loss, the grief, the trauma of the past few years. They faced their own challenges, their own demons, the lingering effects of their ordeal. Margaret's father remained in prison, awaiting trial, his fate uncertain. She had not visited him, had not spoken to him since the night of the warehouse confrontation. She couldn't forgive him, couldn't understand his betrayal, couldn't reconcile the image of the man she had loved with the reality of his treachery. Henry, despite his physical limitations, was determined to rebuild his life, to find a new purpose, to use his experience to help others. He decided to return to law, but not to the world of corporate finance, the world of privilege and power that had corrupted his former colleagues. He chose to dedicate his life to public service, to defending the rights of the poor, the marginalized, the victims of injustice. Margaret, too, sought a new path, a way to make sense of her experiences, to contribute to a better world. She decided to pursue her passion for writing, to use her voice to tell stories, to expose the truth, to advocate for change. She began working with Thomas's former colleagues at the New York Investigator, continuing his legacy of investigative journalism, fighting for social justice, holding the powerful accountable. One crisp autumn morning, as the sun rose over the Hudson River, painting the sky with hues of gold and crimson, Margaret and Henry stood on their balcony, overlooking the city, their arms wrapped around each other, their hearts filled with a mixture of gratitude and hope. They had been through hell, they had faced their demons, they had survived. They had lost much, but they had also gained something precious, something enduring, a love that had been tested to the limit, a bond that had been forged in fire, a commitment to each other and to a better future. "We made it," Henry whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "We actually made it." Margaret nodded, her eyes filled with tears.
"We did," she said.
Together, they looked out at the city, at the river, at the dawn breaking over the horizon, a symbol of hope, of renewal, of the promise of a new day. The war had changed them, had scarred them, had tested them to their limits. But it had also strengthened them, had made them more resilient, more compassionate, more determined to live a life of purpose and meaning. They knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, obstacles to overcome. But they were ready. They were prepared. They had each other. And they had a future to build, a world to change, a love to cherish. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, bathing the city in its warm, golden light, they turned to each other, their eyes meeting, their hearts filled with a love that had endured the darkness and emerged into the dawn. The Hudson, a silent witness to their journey, flowed onward, carrying their hopes and dreams towards an uncertain, but ultimately hopeful, future. The reckoning of love and duty had been made, and they had chosen love. Epilogue. Years later, Margaret sat at her desk, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room. The brownstone was quiet, filled only with the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the faint sounds of the city outside. Henry was at his office, working late, as usual, his dedication to his clients unwavering, his commitment to justice as strong as ever. She was writing, her pen gliding across the page, her words flowing effortlessly, telling a story of love, loss, betrayal, and redemption. It was a story she knew well, a story that had shaped her life, a story that needed to be told. It was the story of their lives, of their wartime romance, of their struggle against a hidden enemy, of their triumph over adversity. It was a story of courage, resilience, and the enduring power of love. She had changed the names, altered some of the details, fictionalized certain aspects of the narrative, but the essence of the story remained true, the emotions raw and authentic, the message clear and compelling. She had finally found the courage to confront her past, to write about her father, about his betrayal, about her forgiveness. It had been a difficult process, painful and cathartic, but it had also been healing, liberating, empowering. She had visited him in prison, many years after the war, after Henry's urging. It had been a strained, emotional meeting, filled with unspoken regrets, unexpressed apologies, and a lingering sense of sadness. He had aged, his spirit broken, his body weakened by years of confinement. He had finally spoken, briefly, about his reasons, his motivations, his misguided belief that he was acting in the best interests of his country. He had been manipulated, deceived, drawn into a web of deceit that had ultimately destroyed him. Margaret had listened, her heart aching, her mind struggling to understand. She had not forgiven him completely, but she had found a measure of peace, a sense of closure, a way to move on with her life. She had published the story under a pseudonym, and it had become a bestseller, resonating with readers across the country, touching hearts, sparking conversations, reminding people of the sacrifices made during the war, the hidden battles fought on the home front, the enduring power of love and loyalty. She and Henry had lived a long and full life together, filled with love, laughter, and a shared commitment to making the world a better place. They had raised a family, watched their children grow, experienced the joys and sorrows of life, always together, always supportive, always in love. As she finished writing the final chapter, she looked up, her eyes gazing out the window, at the city skyline, at the Hudson River, at the setting sun. The sky was ablaze with color, a breathtaking spectacle of beauty and tranquility. She smiled, a gentle, knowing smile, a smile that reflected the wisdom of years, the peace of mind that came from a life well lived, a love that had endured. The story was complete. Her story, their story, a story of a lifetime. The end had found a beginning in the pages she'd written, and the cycle, she felt, was complete.